Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching The Battle of Blair Mountain Part 1 by Extra History. Now, I'll confess, before I saw this video, I was unfamiliar with this event. After some light Googling, it appears to have been a major labor uprising in the early 1920s. I don't specialize in labor history, but I do find it pretty fascinating, so I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
Matewan, West Virginia, May 19th, 1920.
Alright, West Virginia, 1920. They are setting the scene. When I think of West Virginia in the 1920s, I'd imagine there's probably a lot of coal mining.
Police Chief Sid Hatfield stands waiting near a railroad station. 12 deputized men surround the area. Earlier that day, agents from the Banfield-Phelps Detective Agency unlawfully evicted several coal miners, and Hatfield is determined to have a word with their leader, Albert Phelps.
Okay, so these detective agencies were sort of a big thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were a big asset to corporations who wanted to put down labor disputes. The most famous of these that you guys might have heard of are the Pinkertons. So the Pinkertons, but these private detective agencies in general, would be hired by these big corporations in order to handle labor disputes. And by handle, well, sometimes we mean infiltrate strikes, try to sort of sneakily end it, but oftentimes it would lead to a violent confrontation between these private detectives and the striking workers. One of the more famous events would be the Homestead Strike in Pittsburgh, where, Pinkertons and striking workers battled it out. But this was not an uncommon event. So these private detectives, they resorted to violence to put down striking workers. This was a very violent period of American labor history, and labor history in general.
Phelps and his 13 agents arrive on foot, planning to board a train, but Hatfield blocks their path as his deputies close in, meeting them in front of a hardware store. When Hatfield tells Phelps that he and his men are under arrest, Phelps claims that
I would say it is sort of unique that the local law enforcement is actually taking a stand against one of these private detective agencies. Usually they would work sort of hand in hand. I think it's fair to say that American law of this era, whether legislators, law enforcement, or the law itself, was sort of written to allow corporations to act relatively as they pleased, and they often wouldn't experience much pushback from law enforcement. Now, of course, there were exceptions to that, and you had leaders like Teddy Roosevelt, who was pretty intent on bringing the hammer down on these big corporations, but in general, American law was pretty friendly.
That he possesses a warrant to arrest Hatfield. They both know Phelps is lying and share a dark laugh. The town's mayor, also on site, asks to see Phelps' warrant for the evictions. Phelps produces a paper. The mayor, examining it, sees that it's bogus and says so. Phelps then produces his gun. And what happens next triggers the largest American uprising since the Civil War.
Wow, really? The largest American... I guess I'm not really familiar with any American uprisings following the Civil War, but that's still a pretty impressive thing to say.
The Battle of Blair Mountain.
Oh my. I'm ready.
Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. To understand how the Matewan Massacre led to the much larger Battle of Blair Mountain, one must look roughly 30 years before the incident and follow a trail of corporate greed and exploitation perpetrated by the United States coal industry. Though surprisingly, it doesn't start with the coal companies, but with the railroad combines that not only needed the coal to run their engine.
That's not that surprising. If we're going 30 years back, sort of mid to late 1800s, those railroad companies had a lot of power and influence during that era.
But had the means to go into towns throughout the country and corner the market. Now, commercial coal mining started in the U.S. as early as 1701. And by the 1880s, many who needed to subsidize their household income, from local white farmers to European immigrants to African Americans, had settled near the West Virginia coal mines. But in the 1890s, well-heeled developers financed by the railroad companies showed up in Mingo County, where Matewan was located, looking to buy up as much land as possible. It wasn't just the land they were after, but the mineral rights. And once the necessary purchases were made, in came the construction crews. 5,000 strong, they performed the arduous task of chiseling 8 tunnels into the Appalachian foothills, giving the financiers full access to the black gold they had come for.
Yeah, this is some pretty brutal work, by the way. I mean, you could say the working conditions were horrible at this time period, but even today, when working conditions are much improved, coal mining is a tough, tough job. Now, the numbers of coal miners have been dwindling for decades. It's not too prominent a career anymore, but it's really, really bad on your health. There's a high rate of getting health issues. If we're talking about this era, say in the 1890s, there's a high rate of injury. Now, that's true for a lot of industrial jobs in this era. Like I said, legislation was not really helping out the workers. It was more friendly to the businesses. So there were very lax labor regulations. And so there was a lot of workplace injuries in a lot of these industrial jobs, but coal mining is a tough, tough job.
Of course, in order to run a successful mining operation, the company had to lay down miles of railroad line and build roughly 60 bridges to transport the coal out. Though despite the cost, it would prove to be a worthwhile investment. That's because the coal companies, already benefiting from American industrialization, would see even greater gains during World War I. Even before joining the war, the U.S. exported coal to its European allies. But when the war ended, so did that increased demand.
Yeah, America made a lot of cash money off of both world wars, by the way, by selling goods to the Europeans. Because, in both wars, America came out relatively unscathed, we'll say, compared to Europe, right? America definitely took losses in both wars. I'm not denying that, but Europe was devastated by World War II and pretty devastated by World War I. So America managed to make a quick buck off of selling them goods and natural resources during both world wars. In fact, I'd say these were some of the major reasons that America would rise to become sort of an economic superpower during this era. I mean, there were many events that contributed to that, but, the profits made from the world wars definitely contributed.
And when companies like Stone Mountain Coal Camp saw a loss in profits, their first move was to squeeze their workers. Stuck in the middle of this ebb and flow were the coal miners themselves. In their haste to put food on the table for their families, they collectively put themselves in a situation that made them practically indentured servants. This is how it worked. Once you signed on to join a mining outfit, you were provided with appropriate clothes, supplies, and even housing for you and your family. Sounds like a great deal.
Sure, sounds like a great deal. But like they said you're basically indentured servants. That's not really an over-exaggeration. You were basically owned by this company. Everything you had was provided by them, and your whole life revolved around, company life. We have, say, company towns. There were towns built by these companies where everything was owned and run by the company. You could be paid in company money. You were buying goods from the company store. Your whole life revolved around the company you worked for. So, it's pretty crazy.
Right? Except for the fact your supplies were leased from the company.
Exactly.
And a fee for them came out of your pay. Also, the company store that you and
Okay, they were explaining what I just said, so yeah.
your family bought provisions from, usually the only store in town, would often charge whatever they wanted. And worse still,
There's no competition. You might be in a company town, and so the company runs everything. Or even if you're not in a company town, maybe the coal company's the only one company big enough and rich enough to run a store like that. So they really have a ton of control over the local economy. And like they said, they can sell the goods for whatever they want. They can take whatever they want out of your paycheck because you really don't have other options.
instead of money, mining companies would issue scrip instead of actual pay that could only be spent in the company store.
And that's what I was saying about company money. You're buying from the company store using company money, scrip. The company runs your life.
And keep in mind, coal mining itself is neither the easiest nor the safest job one could have. You're literally
the opposite.
working in a cave, deep underground, chipping away at veins of coal. And if someone gets careless with one of the lamps, a single spark could ignite the ambient dust, causing the entire mine to explode. In
Brutal.
fact, one such incident killed 362 miners in...
Holy shit, 306. God, that's a disaster. That's like a humanitarian disaster. Imagine you live in a small West Virginian town and a disaster kills 362 people. That's a pretty insane scale.
Monongah, West Virginia in 1907, a mere 13 years before the events we're covering today. Now you'd think that because this dangerous work was essential to the economy, someone would actually advocate for these working class men. Perhaps someone at the federal, state, or heck, even local levels. But in most cases, you'd be wrong.
Yeah, I think, we're all cynical enough. We know otherwise.
Even in West Virginia, Governor John J. Cornwell, who had only one office in 1916 due to coal miner support, seemed reluctant to run afoul of the mining companies. In fact, when 5,000 angry miners rose...
I think you could say that's a beautiful tradition that continues in West Virginia politics today, aka politicians being owned by the coal industry, or being an active participant in the coal industry. But,
rose up in nearby Logan County, he called the White House and requested federal troops to put down the uprising. As for the mining companies themselves, they had their ways of maintaining order. From subsidizing police forces like the one in Logan to flat-out bribing officials. They'd also employ men from the Baldwin-Felts Company who, along with the on-the-take local law enforcement, would supervise activity within the mines. These security officers occasionally roughed up miners to remind them who was boss and suppressed anything that resembled unionizing.
Look, these companies had an incredible amount of power. Now, when we talk about, say, the Gilded Age, we're talking about the late 1800s, maybe into the early 1900s, where these big corporations run by, these impressive figures, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, etc., these, what we now call robber barons, they controlled the heights of industry, and they had a lot of influence over American politics, society, culture. Now, that was tapered off a little bit when we head into the early 1900s, a bit, but as we can see, they still held on to a lot of power, particularly, say, in states like West Virginia, which was and, remained for a while very industry heavy. I mean, coal mining was really the heart of West Virginia, and, now that it's declined, they're having a hard time moving on. These coal companies, these big industrialists would have a lot of power.
Despite the mining companies' use of threats and hired goons, representatives from the United Mine Workers of America showed up anyway. Though they didn't exactly walk into town announcing themselves, for that would have prompted a quick and, more often than not, violent response from the Baldwin-Felts agents.
Yeah, that, you're a union rep, you walk into a town like this, announce yourself, you're putting your life at risk, frankly. I mean, you probably won't be killed, you might, but you are definitely risking getting beaten up, getting thrown out of town, getting detained, one of those things, definitely.
Instead, they'd usually sneak into town, pretending to be a salesman of some sort, quietly engaging miners on the sly until someone either listened to them, or they were found out and escorted out of town, or chased out, or beaten and told to leave. The union leaders from the UMW realized that if the prosperous mines of West Virginia's southern border remained non-union, the situation would have an adverse effect on the union's collective bargaining power in that region. But unionizing was a tough sell for most of the miners of Matewan. Many had been taught to distrust unions, either from company-produced literature or company-friendly preachers, which tended to claim all labor unions and their members were communists.
I mean, look, even today, companies have a lot of power to prevent unionization. They can really propagandize to their workforces. So imagine how it was back in this era, in the 1920s, when the whole town is ran by this one company, and they have a lot of allies, whether friendly preachers, friendly politicians, whatever it is. These miners, everything they're hearing from almost every direction is going to be saying, don't unionize. These union reps are bad. They're communists. They're trying to cheat you out of money. You're not going to get anything from joining the union. All of these different things. If you've been told that for years, it's sort of very hard to get yourself out of that mindset.
And bear in mind, this was at a time when labor strikes across the country commonly devolved into street brawls or worse, meaning participating could be dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. Not only have they been propagandized in the other direction, but even if you do want to participate in a strike or join a union, it is a very risky proposition. I mean, you could be putting your life on the line. or your job on the line. It's a dangerous thing to do in this era.
African American miners were particularly reluctant to get themselves caught in any union talk, long resolved that there would never be any real upward mobility for them. They also knew that they were still better off than they had been as sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South. And the European migrants, well, they were pretty much under the same impression, given that they had no intention to return to their native lands.
Yeah, particularly in the early days of unionization, there was a lot of racial tension. Like white-only unions say. And so, obviously, if you're a black worker, that's going to put you off. Now, at this point, we're probably not talking about a white-only union, but there probably is still that racial tension lingering. So if you're a black worker, you may not be interested in getting involved in this union with, these white workers who probably don't even treat you well. In addition, it was sort of a tactic of union busters or the company to, say to black workers, I mean, we've got propaganda all around to tell them that, these unions aren't going to do anything for you. I mean, look, they're racialized, they're discriminatory. And so, black workers would get the impression that the unions weren't for them, they were for white workers. And so that sort of racial tension was definitely a detriment to the American labor movement for many years, but particularly these earlier years.
But the Matewan miners eventually did go union and launched a strike after an empty gesture wage increase that just so happened to coincide with a price hike at the company store. A tactic
Nice.
that left the miners with very little money. And it's worth mentioning here that despite the lingering racism and xenophobia of the time, all the miners stood together.
All
Black
right.
and white, native-born and immigrant, all united to seek fair pay and safer work conditions.
And, I mean, there you go. While there was this racial tension, sometimes stoked by industrialists, people could come together despite their backgrounds. They could come together on their working class identity and try and stand up for themselves. And that's what we're seeing here.
And that's when the terrorizing started. First came the evictions from company-owned housing, which was to be expected, so most of the
Well, this is the thing. The more you think about it, the worse the idea of these company towns seems, or even the relationship between these corporations and these workers during this time period. Because, if you're joining a union or striking, not only are you risking your life and your job, it could be dangerous, but now the company can evict you from your home because they own it. They own your tools, they can repurpose those, they can take that out of your paycheck. This is when it gets dangerous because, like we said, they own basically your entire life, and so they can use that against you.
displaced miners created a tent compound a few miles away from their abandoned houses, where they hunted small game and scavenged for food. And though a small emergency fund from the union arrived, it was hardly enough for such a large group.
Yeah.
Next, Baldwin Felts agents took to strafing the tents with machine gun fire. Scared and injured, but not broken, the mining families nursed their wounded and stood their ground. And that's
Jeez.
when the Stone Mountain Coal Corporation sent Baldwin Felts agents to buy off Matewan's local politicians, as they'd done in other places. Except this time, it didn't work.
Wow.
Mayor Caldwell
How about that? What are the rare cases where it didn't work? Shout out to the mayor, I guess.
Esterman was offered a bribe, hand-delivered by Albert Felts, the brother of one of the Baldwin Felts founders. Felts wanted to station machine guns on the various roofs about the town, but out of loyalty to the mining community, Testerman refused the bribe, and so did Police Chief Sid Hatfield.
How about that? Some incorruptible politicians. That is a rare sight, particularly, well, I was going to say particularly during this era, but really at any era. Some politicians who aren't willing to take a bribe and are actually going to stand up for their constituents. Something to be respected there.
A former miner known for his carousing, his marksmanship, and his being related to the Hatfield side of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, he
Oh,
made
really?
it his mission to thwart the Baldwin Felts agents during
He was probably a rowdy guy then.
the months prior to the confrontation, often coming to the aid of coal miners and their families as they were being evicted. Hatfield
Wow.
even enlisted Sheriff George Blankenship, who helped slow the evictions to a crawl by arresting agents and tying evictions up in court.
Impressive. And I think I said at the beginning of this video when they were talking about how Hatfield wanted to arrest these private detectives, I literally said, wow, that's rare. That's interesting. Law enforcement is usually friendly to the Pinkertons or these private detective agencies. And as you can see, this is very much an exception, so that's cool.
All this fueled a simmering animosity between the two factions, which spurred Phelps to draw his gun during the railroad standoff.
Uh-oh.
Gun blasts ring out, one after another. Phelps shoots Testerman. Hatfield shoots Phelps.
I mean, this seems like worse than a regular labor dispute, though, because, usually you sort of have this coalition of the company who's hired these detective agencies and who have paid off the local law enforcement and the local politicians all against the workers. It's everybody versus labor. But in this case, the local politicians seem to have been relatively friendly with the workers. So, now these private detective agencies, this company is in conflict with local politicians. That seems much more of a big deal. I mean, you could get away with killing and fighting against, poor workers, but could they get away with fighting against the local mayor, against the police chief? Would that have been acceptable? I'm curious to see if they're going to get in trouble for this gunfight that's just broken out.
Arrogance allowed the agents to get caught off guard, and the deputized miners, with their weapons mostly ready, take the advantage.
Damn.
When the smoke clears, 10 men are dead.
Ooh.
Mayor Testerman, 2 miners, and 7 Baldwin Phelps detectives, including Albert Phelps and his brother Lee.
Wow.
It was the first time the miners had clocked a win against Baldwin.
I mean, it is a W, but they did lose the mayor, who seemed relatively friendly to their cause, so that's not good.
Phelps. But if the Union men of Matewan thought that the shooting was done, they were dead wrong. And we'll tell you all about the Battle of Blair Mountain proper next episode. Oh man, Zoe, I am chomping at the bit to tell the second half of the story next week. But until
I'm
then,
excited.
you do have to start thinking about what's for dinner. Thanks, HelloFresh. Time to get cooking. Hello.
Alright, so you guys know the deal. Go and check out Extra History's video. It's linked down below. Check out their sponsorship, give them a like, subscribe to their channel, show them support for making this fantastic content. Yeah, that was a good video. I really enjoyed that one. It was very interesting. I'm totally unfamiliar with this event, but, I am interested in American labor history. Very curious, very interesting that the local law enforcement and the mayor decided to side with the miners instead of the company. And that's a rare occurrence. But yeah, I'm also very interested to see where this goes. I'm not going to spoil myself on this series. I'm just going to watch it as it comes out. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.